Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We have a bunch of folks streaming in here, but at the same time, we definitely would like to keep things moving. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce my fellow colleague and co-owner from Torchbox. Maciek Barron is going to talk to all of you today about Wagtail and AI agentic coding. All right, take it away, Maciek.
Great, thank you, Megan. Yes, so as a form of introduction, my name is Maciek Barron, and I'm a senior engineer at Torchbox. And I've been using AI for coding for quite some time. And a few months ago, I started using AI agents and agentic tools as well. So, what I wanted to do today is talk through some of the things that I've discovered and learned, explain how to set things up and also how you can use such tools for coding, creating Wagtail websites, or any project really. So this will be the essence of this talk, and I hope you find it interesting. But first, let's have a little introduction to AI itself and how we sort of see it as developers. So I'm sure that a lot of you have gone through this sort of Kubler-Ross grief cycle with AI, especially at the beginning where you weren't sure like where it's going and what the future holds for us, you know. And at the beginning, I remember I was thinking like, AI is not that great, you know, it's not good enough, it's not gonna do anything. And quite quickly, you started seeing all these models and all these tools coming out and thinking like, gosh, actually, it's getting quite good. And are we actually going to lose our jobs? Is this going to replace us? Like, you start getting frustrated and you start getting anxious about it, right? But then slowly, as I was sort of discovering it and sort of looking at it into it more, you sort of start realizing that, well, you know, maybe it's not that much of a deal, and you can actually use it for something beneficial in terms of your like your workflow and the way you create websites and code and create software. So I'm sort of at the acceptance stage now in terms of where I am in with AI, and I've used it in a few different ways, and I have my opinions, and I think it's not perfect. I think there are problems associated with it, but I think there's also a lot of benefits. So what I want to do is give it a go and tell you how to set things up and essentially how to use these tools. So today I'll be specifically talking about a Claude Code and how to use that for coding. And I'll go through the setup, I'll go through the basics, how it works, and how you can sort of configure it. I'll talk about context management, and then I'll talk about some Wagtail specific topics as well, and how you can use it to create good Wagtail websites. So let's start with the initial setup. So as you probably can guess, it's a very simple way to install software. You just do npm install to install Claude Code. You give it a prompt, it does it for you, and yeah, that's how it works. It's very simple to set it up. You don't require anything at all. What you have to do though, once you sort of start working with Claude Code, is to start giving it a bit more information, right? So we're going to start with a prompt. So in terms of what Claude Code can do for you, it can, you know, you can tell it to create a model, you can create a template, you can create a CSS file, you can review your code. So there's a lot of things that you can do with it. You essentially use natural language and you talk to it as you would talk to a fellow developer, right? And sort of give it tasks and tell it like, hey, I want you to run tests using this specific command and so forth. So how does it work? So in terms of the way it works, normally what you have is your front end and back end. So this is different to the front end and back end that we are used to when it comes to coding in general, because the front end here, what we refer to as the front end, is the AI agent, right? So we have either the Claude Code or Open Code or Gemini CLI or anything like that. That's the piece of software that reads out commands and performs certain actions, right? And then we have the back end, which is the AI model itself. So that could be Claude Sonnet, Opus, that could be any of the other, ChatGPT, GPT-4, GPT-5 models that you use. So the front end communicates with the back end in a way. So for instance, you know, the front end may have its system prompts that it uses to edit the code. It offers a certain number of tools, like tools to edit a file, to search for files and so forth. Give it to the model, and the model then works out what it needs to do, and that's how it sort of works. So I'm going to talk about this a bit more in a bit more detail later on, but just wanted to give you like a brief overview of sort of how you can split this sort of when it comes to infrastructure. So I briefly talked about having a file inside your setup. So the first slide showed this is how you install the Claude Code and this is how you set up the software. But in order to make it work well with your project, you need to have basically an agent file. So in this case, we have our Claude Markdown file. It's basically a README, but designed for consumption by the agent. So this README file will contain, for instance, instructions or basically a brief description of the project itself, right? So you can use Claude to generate one for you if you want it to be sort of automated. But what you want to make sure is that it sort of provides a very brief but also concise and detailed way of how to work through your code and for how to work through your code base as well. So if there's a lot to write about, you can also split into separate files and then tell it that if you ever say you need to work on the front end, look at this file. If you want to do some tests, look at that file, and so forth and so forth. So I'll describe in a second why we do this, and also I'll talk about context management so that you understand, for instance, why we don't just write 2 million lines in this file and describe every single aspect of your project. But to sum it up, it's just a file like a README, but for bots. Then what I want to talk about is MCP servers. So you may have heard about them before. It's MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. And what it does, it standardizes access to tools, resources, and prompts. I think it's quite useful, but also a bit overhyped. I think at some point people were just installing loads of MCP servers because they thought like, wow, all these things are really powerful. But I do think that certain MCPs can be quite useful, but also some of them seem completely pointless, like an MCP to get the current date and time. I think that's pretty pointless. You can still tell the agent how to use an API or how to use local script or how to use different tools, but it's a good way of standardizing access to that. And it's a new technology, so we're still learning how it fits in. So I, at the moment, use a couple. So I use Context 7, which gives you access to most up-to-date documentation. And I also use Chrome DevTools, which allows you to use and control a browser. Previously, I used Playwright MCP as well to do the same thing. And also previously, I used Zen, which is an MCP server that allows you to use different AI models for different problems. So you can actually use Claude Code alongside other models and other services. But now I use a slightly different method, which I'm also going to talk about in a second. Right. So now that we have this set up and working, let's talk about the whole workflow and how we actually work through this to work with our code and make Claude Code or any other agent do everything properly for us. So the way we use this tool is incredibly important, right? So this is a tool, it's not a hack or a shortcut, because I think a lot of people, when you hear about vibe coding, I think people just use it as a hack and like, hey, it's a really easy way to make a piece of software. But I don't think that's right. I think it's more of a tool, and planning is still very, very important. So you can't give it just like a vague prompt and be like, hey, create a Twitter clone for me. I mean, that won't work. What you want is a healthy, well-documented code base. You want to have tests that allow you to verify what the agent is doing. And like I said, context management is crucial. So I'm going to speak about it in a second. Once you have these elements together, then the software can work like wonders for you and actually create code that works really well and is reliable. If you don't have these elements in place, you'll be struggling, you'll be going in loops, and the agent will just start doing things that you don't want it to do. So again, it's a tool, it's not a hack or a shortcut, and you have to keep that in mind. So for instance, here's what I've been doing at the beginning. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to define a workflow in my Claude file that defines what I expect the agent to do. But at some point, I realized that it wasn't really following the workflow. So I asked Claude Code to improve this for me and create something more specific so that it can follow the workflow. So what I did, it added these sort of signs. It's mandatory, you have to follow this, do not skip these steps. And that improved it a tiny bit. But then it's also started sort of skipping some of these steps and not working really well. So I asked Claude Code again, like, what should I do for you to not skip those steps? And it created this massive thing saying like critical workflow reminder, you have to follow this list of steps because otherwise you will violate the established process. So I realized like, well, I don't think this is the right way of doing it. And there must be a better way of doing it instead of shouting out Claude Code. And I realized that essentially AI-based automation is unreliable and we need to use standard automation. In order to achieve that, we can use hooks, either like git commit hooks or Claude Code hooks. So essentially, we have a guarantee that something will happen once an action is performed, right? So for instance, we can define a hook that once Claude Code edits a file, they can then run a command for you automatically, for instance, right? This could be a linter, this could be something else. You can define the same thing using Git. So for instance, before Git commit is run, then a command will be run to make sure that, for instance, all tests pass and so forth. This will also optimize the context because you're not like spamming the agent with all these different instructions and all these reminders to run certain tools at certain stages. So that's really important. So this is when I realized I wasn't using Claude Code properly. It was my fault for not doing it the way it should be done. And I think we're all still sort of learning like what is the best workflow with these tools to make sure it works properly. But we have to remember that even things like that are not perfect, and Claude can get confused if your hooks don't provide appropriate feedback. So, for instance, exit codes matter. So, if you write little scripts that you want to run at certain stages, you want to make sure that 0 is for success, 1 for non-blocking issues, and 2 for blocking issues, right? So, you can write a little bash script or Python script that does something, and you want to make sure that the return code, or the exit code rather, gives information to Claude and tells it like this failed, you have to do something else, or this is a non-blocking issue, just a warning for you to read or something like that. So here's my current workflow that I use with Claude Code. So first I break up tasks into subtasks. And I think, again, planning is very important when you use these tools. I gather requirements without AI. Then I use Gemini to do some planning. I create a plan that I save in a Markdown file. I give it to Claude Code. It writes the code. It runs tests. It writes the tests, and then goes into this loop. What I do next is I review the code using a separate tool. So for instance, either using Gemini again, or for instance, there are other ways like you can use the LLM CLI tool and connect it to things like OpenRouter, where you can grab other agents and sort of consult them and make sure that they review your code. Then again, I apply the feedback with Claude Code. I commit a second time. And I can automate this process as well, right? So I can, for instance, tell it like, okay, once you commit, then ask this agent to review your code and then apply feedback to it. So this whole process can be automated, but obviously it's important to keep an eye on it. So I'm just looking on time. It's been 12 minutes, so I think we're still doing well. Also, so if you work with agents, you might want to work on something on your own, or maybe use 2 agents to work on different features. So in order to achieve that, you can use Git work trees. So that allows you to have multiple working trees in separate folders that share the same Git repository. So for instance, you can have the agent work in one feature on one branch in one folder, and you can use a separate folder to work on your own code as well, or your own feature rather. So it's quite a useful thing, and I think is commonly overlooked, this feature of Git, so very useful. Right, so I've been talking about context management for a while, so I'm not going to sort of dive into it a bit deeper because I think it's very, very important, and I think context management will actually be something that future developers will have to learn and have to remember because it will be super crucial in terms of the quality of the code that it generates. So as you can imagine, with increased noise, the quality of work done by Claude will decrease, like because we call it context rot because there's more and more information being provided to the model. There's more and more sort of tokens that needs to process. Obviously, it will get slower. It will get more expensive to run. And I think context management starts at the first prompt. Like you have to optimize the instructions that you give to an agent. You want to make sure that your documentation is right, and you have to provide good feedback as well. That's very, very important. And you have to also remember that this is not a colleague of yours that will remember the past project you've worked on. Like Claude will always, or any agent will start afresh every time, unless you have some sort of memory set up for it, right? So you have to make sure that the information that it's given is enough for it to be able to work on different projects and different features that you want it to work on. You can also ask it to keep things in the Claude file or the agent file itself, right? So as it's working for different features, you can tell it to be remembering things or recording like learnings into a separate file as well. And when you give feedback, you have to make sure that it's good feedback, right? It's not sort of like, oh, this doesn't work it out. You want to make sure that it's given all the right information because otherwise it can go in a loop and sort of try to break things and before it fixes them. So remember to give quality feedback, and you have to point at specific files. You need to give examples, be precise and detailed in your prompts, and avoid unnecessary peacock terms, but emphasize as well the importance of different problems, right? And I think tests are incredibly important because it gives automatic agent feedback, right? So if you have any unit tests, the functional tests, then every time the agent does something, they can quickly then basically evaluate the output and what they've done, and then quickly sort of fix the problem. So I think, looking at all of this, I think when you use agents and use this sort of type of programming, it actually enforces good dev habits as well, right? Because you document your code, you write good tests, all so that, the agent can use this and provide good code and good quality code for you. But also it helps you and other developers on your team because of the documentation, because of the tests and so forth. So I think it's sort of, hopefully, if you approach it in a proper way, it actually sort of emphasizes and sort of strengthens these different sort of techniques and things that good developers use. Right, so let's briefly focus on Wagtail. So obviously, all the things that I've mentioned so far, you can use them for different projects and different code bases. It's not specific to Python or Django Wagtail. But there are a few things I wanted to talk about when it comes to Wagtail. So, as you probably know, the way models are sort of created, they are trained on loads of data, and this might be code bases, this might be texts, this might be different pieces of data that then form the sort of brain of the model itself. And I think what is good about Wagtail is that a lot of Wagtail problems are actually Django problems. So even if, say, Wagtail is not as popular as, say, WordPress, which has a larger sort of user base, there's still enough data in those models that allows you to sort of work with Wagtail and solve different problems. So it's really good that Django is the sort of backbone of Wagtail because the data that is used to train these models contains a lot of these examples. Um, and I think because of that, when you work with these agents, they excel at defining page models, for instance, but they can struggle in other areas, and I'll discuss that in a moment. Um, I think what's useful as well in some of these agents, like for instance Claude Code, you can create sub-agents as well. So you can actually create agents that focus on specific types of tasks or expertise in your Wagtail workflow. So for instance, you can have an agent which is an expert in writing unit tests and migrations, or you can have another sub-agent that works, say, on creating SAS files or creating migration files and so forth. So it's quite useful because then you can isolate the context of these different sub-agents and they will do things in isolation without polluting each other's context. And this is really good for, setups like Wagtail because obviously there's quite a lot of layers to a Wagtail website. You'll have your page models, you'll have your templates, whether it's Ginger 2 or Django templates, you have your tests, you'll have your migrations that have to be written and tested and so forth. So it's sometimes quite good to split that work into different sort of streams, and then that way things can happen simultaneously, but also it won't affect the context window of other agents as well. So I think that's a pretty good way of approaching it. So Megan, who introduced me earlier, she actually wrote a really good article called "What AI Tools Get Right and Wrong with Wagtail," and I really recommend this article because she used the AI tools for building a Wagtail website and working Wagtail projects, and she sort of listed quite a few of the sort of good things and bad things about using these tools, and I think this was really good. So yeah, the link is below, and I'm sure you can find it on the Wagtail blog as well if you look for it. So definitely recommend reading that. Great. So having spoken about how to use these tools and what they're good for, I also want to talk a bit more about the current challenges that we are facing with these tools because that's actually quite important as well. These tools are not perfect and obviously they evolve at such a quick pace, things change all the time. And so it's important to sort of understand the limitations of these tools and how we can use them. So the first big one is security. So people talk about the YOLO mode of these agents where you just allow them to do anything you want. I don't think that's a good idea. It might seem tempting because you don't get interrupted and the agent will just do what it wants to do. But I think a good practice is to keep a list of commands that you don't want it to ever use and perhaps a list of allowed commands as well. So here's an example of some commands that you can deny because it's possible for the agent to get confused and do something it's not supposed to, even if there's no prompt injection. You may have heard about the term prompt injection. It's when a prompt contains maybe something that it shouldn't contain uh, in certain files, data sets that the agent is consuming. So this can prevent both accidents and attacks. So it's quite important that you think about it. You also have to be careful when you expose the agent to MCP servers, because obviously it's an agent that can read some of your files. Those files can contain API keys, it can contain sort of some secrets and sensitive data. So if you don't pay attention to what the tools you use and how they sort of extract information from your project, it can be quite dangerous. So you have to make sure that you look at those and see what they are actually doing. Supply chain attacks can have a huge impact on your project, and this is something that you have to keep in mind. So, just to sum up, if you use Claude Code, make sure that you have a list of commands that you deny, a list of commands that you approve, and instead of using the YOLO mode, because that can be quite dangerous. So here's an example I found online where you can get an agent very confused and it can do something it's not supposed to. Here's an example of something to bear in mind, right? Because like, at the end of the day, it's not a dev, it's a model. So it might do weird things. Another, well, challenge itself, I don't know if it's a challenge or more of a just the nature of things. New things come out every week. Like we have new models, new agents, new AI tools, new ways of working, new plugins, new MCP servers every single day, every single week. And sometimes it's very, very tricky to remember and also keep an eye on everything that comes out. So you might be using one tool one day and learning how to use it, and then suddenly you hear about a new tool and you sort of jump to that. So uh, it's challenging, but at the same time, I think, a lot of people are trying different things, and we are living in these times where things are very dynamic and exciting because all these different things come up. But I think it's important to not get discouraged and not to sort of keep jumping ship and jumping on the latest thing, because a lot of things are quite similar, but also like just because it's new doesn't mean it's good or it's better to what you're using right now. So as long as you sort of stick to one thing and sort of make sure you learn it well and you understand it, then you can move on to something else if you want. But yeah, I think that's also quite challenging at the moment. So another problem is obviously hallucinations. I'm sure all of us heard about hallucinations when it comes to AI, and also outdated knowledge. So hallucinations are a problem because the model can be very convinced it's right, even though it's wrong, and it's suggesting something that doesn't actually exist. On the right-hand side, I shared a screenshot where basically the model thought I'm trying to deceive it, and it got really, really angry. It was basically saying that what I did was a complete fabrication and I'm just using some evil tactics only because I was trying to point it at the correct documentation, the correct source code. So you have to be very careful. Also, the solutions that you might suggest might be based on older versions of Wagtail, for instance, sometimes very outdated. So it's important that you make sure that your model is using, or your agent rather, is using up-to-date documentation. So again, there are MCP servers that can handle that, which is really good. And again, you might even struggle sometimes to convince the model that they are wrong. Like they will just think like whatever you're doing is not correct, and they will strongly believe that the information that's deeply embedded in them is actually correct. And I had moments where basically I was arguing with the model because it was doing that. So it is quite frustrating and funny sometimes. So bear that in mind. And another challenge is the cost, right? Because it can get quite pricey overall. Some of these tools, cost you like 150, 200, $250 a month, if I just put some calculations here when it comes to some of these models, and obviously there are cheaper models, there are more expensive models, and this will definitely get cheaper over time, not only because technology will be cheaper, but also the models will improve and be optimized. So at the moment, can be quite expensive, but also there are free versions of certain models if you want to try them out without paying any money. And I'm sure that Gemini as well from Google actually offers some free allowance, quite substantial allowance, I think, for Google users. So definitely something to try out. But one thing to keep in mind, I think. Right, so some final thoughts from me. I don't think AI will replace us, but I think it will definitely drastically change software development. I think context and agent workflow management will be key developer skills. I think the skills that we'll be looking developers will be very different, but it doesn't mean that developers will disappear. I think the way we write code will change, and there will be some skills that we're using a lot more, or skills that we haven't even had before. And I think, AI is a tool which still requires knowledge and experience. And it's not something that will replace a dev and just, we won't be vibe coding our future, I think. And I think developers will also have front end and back end preferences and potentially provider preferences as well. So you might like a certain agent that sort of manages your changes, but you also might have a preferred model that you use as well, or a provider, because based on cost and latency and so forth. So that'll be a thing as well. And I think, models can suggest code which is outdated and doesn't follow latest specs, so we have to keep that in mind. I think that Wagtail benefits from being a Django application and sort of having that retained knowledge inside those models that can sort of improve the way you work with things. And I also think that we are still very early and everything is quite volatile and things will keep changing at an intense pace. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Like, don't get discouraged if you've been learning one thing and suddenly everyone else is doing another thing. It's normal, I think. It's just the way things are with technologies like this. They keep improving, keep changing all the time. At some point, probably things will get standardized and worked out. So maybe there'll be fewer things to remember. But again, just give it a go. Don't be scared of it. And I think it's not going to affect us or our careers in any way, in a sense that it won't replace us, but it'll definitely affect the way we work with code and what we'll be looking in future developers as well. Thank you. So this is all my thoughts about agents, and I hope you found it very, or at least a tiny bit interesting. And if you have any questions, just please let me know. I saw there were some messages popping up on chat. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to read them, so I'll just mute myself and maybe try to go through them in a second. And I might not stop sharing in case someone wants to look at a slide, but I'll just mute myself for the time being. Thank you.
All right. We do have a couple questions for you in the Q&A area that let's go ahead and answer some of those. The first one comes from Andrew Seltzer. Says, do you think Wagtail should have an agents.md file? And if so, what do you think it should contain?
I think that's a great question. I haven't seen many open source projects yet which have an agent's MD file. There are a few, and I think it's interesting that people and teams like that are thinking about including them in those repositories. But I think this is definitely like a far-reaching thing, once we have a file like that, because I think there might be a lot of discussions about what to include with inside those files within open source teams. And I think it's definitely a potential source of friction because many different people have opinions like what's the right thing to include and tweaking wordings and things like that. But if say theoretically we had a agents file in a Wagtail in a core Wagtail repository, definitely we would obviously describe the main aspects of the code base in terms of like how it differs from regular Django and how we are using Django to achieve things like having pages and having a different sort of admin panel that manages their pages and so forth. So that will be definitely quite important. I also think definitely how to write good tests and make sure that your code is testable so that the agent always writes tests and always verifies things before or after writing them. And again, there could be wider discussion whether we want to use a test-driven development approach here, where we ask the agent to first write tests that fail and then write code to meet those tests. But again, I think there will probably be a lot of discussions and a lot of different conflicting thoughts about this. So it might be difficult to establish one, but we'll see, maybe in the future.
All right. Ralph is asking, where do you define the deny options?
It's in the settings file, so you can do that in a few places. You can either do this in your local Claude configuration file within the project itself, or you can have a global deny file as well. I don't remember the exact location off the top of my head. I think that's in your home directory Claude, and then I think in the project file, I think it's also in .claude. But it's essentially whenever Claude asks you, do you want to just accept this for this project, and you click yes, it will add an entry to your file anyway, so you can try finding where that is, and then you can add things manually as well and deny the things as well. So yeah, sorry, I don't remember that off the top of my head, but I'm sure you will find it if you just look for it in your project. Thank you.
All right. This will be the last question, and hopefully it's probably not a quick answer though, but which model do you find to be best for Wagtail?
That's a tricky question because I've been using a lot of different ones recently, and I don't think I had enough time to spend enough time with one of them for an elongated period of time to see like, oh, this one's definitely better. New ones keep appearing all the time. So for some time, I've been using Sonnet. Now we have Sonnet 4.5, so I've been using that a lot. And to be honest, it was quite good. Um, I don't think Gemini is that great, at least Gemini Pro. I think Gemini Pro has a lot more hallucinations than I've noticed, say, in the Anthropic models. I think I've used Quen Code. I hope I remember this correctly. Quen Code as well, and it was pretty good, I'd say. So there are a few options out there, I think, but yeah, I don't think there's one preferred option at the moment. But I think Gemini is good for planning, but I wouldn't say for coding. So I can maybe say which model I don't like for Wagtail, but not which one I like. So avoid Wagtail for avoid Gemini for writing Wagtail, but try other models if you want.
All right, that's all the time we have, folks. Thank you so much. This chat was so active. I'm definitely going to share the transcript with Maciek so that he can catch up with y'all on any of the questions that came through there. You can also chat with each other in the lobby if you'd like as well. All right, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening.